So who are I'm Tiff, and this is me and my 10-year-old Will going night skiing. We recently moved from the big city of Calgary to a tiny ski village of Kimberley. I also have a Nolan who just completed his first season on the ski team. As you can tell, we like skiing. I have my 4-year-old shepherd and co-worker in my remote office named Ashley, and my partner in crime of 22 years, and it's actually our wedding anniversary today, and his name's Rob. I've been in research my whole career from 2002 when I was studying primates at the university to 2009 doing market research at ATP Financial, and then moving into UX during ATP's digital transformation in 2016 and helping rebuild our mobile app and online banking. I now lead the UX research practice for the product Benevity. During my time both at the bank and Benevity, I've had the pleasure of partnering with Greg in some of my favorite projects. So over to you, Greg.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining tonight. So I'm Greg, and this is a photo of me laughing while my partner Laura was telling me I am absolutely horrible at headshots, and she's right. And so I thought, oh, this is the best headshot I can take because it's very honest about how much I hate the process. So like Tiff, I've been in research my whole career. I used to do a lot of academic research in human factors and healthcare and transportation and design creativity, and did a little bit of teaching at MRU and usability. And my first daughter was born around 2019. And around that time, I thought, hey, I should leave the academic environment and the pension and all the security to get into contracting. And Tiff helped persuade me to do that because that was my first contract job with her at ATB doing UX research. And then shortly after that, I had another daughter and decided I should leave my contract and try to start a research consultancy focused on UX research and human factors. And really shortly after that, about 4 projects dried up, and I had 2 kids and no work for about 4 months. And then Tiff to the rescue again. She brought me on to Benevity for the project that we're going to talk about today. And since then, things have been pretty smooth sailing, and it's all so far so good. So thanks for joining us today. Yeah, MRU, great place to be. I'm not saying it's better than UFC, but I'll say it. I'll say it to this group.
Uh-oh, now we're getting into an even more controversial topic. Now that you know who we are, you probably want to hear experience with personas. So both of us have been presentation and persona projects before. We've all had the chance to watch how it was used, how long it lasted, and how much value it added because we were still working it. The point is that we've been excited about persona. We've helped execute incredibly thoughtful personas and communicated them across an organization, championed them in projects, and have learned some things that we'll share. One of my key takeaways, decision-making doesn't happen at the persona level. It's very risky to design an entire product or product experience around one example of a user. Presentation is a case study that represents work that we did going through the UX maturity curve a little bit with persona, and our goal is to share those learnings with you. Greg, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so my experience with personas over the last little bit is that they're really easy to sell, but it makes me sad to sell them. And that's partly because in my experience, they're fun to teach and they're fun to do, and you can use them if you're doing hardware or software, and people can wrap their heads around them, and they're received well because they come across as these kind of like shiny research artifacts. Everyone's like, ooh, this is nice. But I always find they end up outdated. They kind of get looked at once or twice and left behind, even if you stick them on a wall somewhere. People walk by the wall and look at something else. And so, yeah, I'm in the same boat as probably a lot of people here, where it's a lot of work to create a one-pager that we don't use that much. And so that's my experience with personas.
So before we get too far into the presentation, let's level set a bit on personas. We'll stick to this definition of personas from the Action Design Foundation, which nicely aligns with used in market research, being fictitious representations of people you would find in a segment. This is how I've used my past experience. In my past role at ATB, our team had just finished a huge segmentation project that had 3 super segment, which was based on life stage, then segments that moved through those life stages, and finally personas, presented the people you would find in those segments. Greg helped this project specifically helping creating alternative personas, which had a differing ability, and it focused on accessibility accommodations that were part of their daily experience. We were all very proud of this project. As we'll explore later, even those incredibly data-driven of personas were barely used.
So even if you don't like that definition of personas, when we were looking at this and thinking about personas, pretty much every definition or articulation you can find, it says you're creating a made-up person to represent your product. And at the best, right, you've got some user-centered data in there and they're data-driven personas, but ultimately they end up being caricatures of real people. And that is a really easy way to add a lot of flair or opinion into the persona. That is fictional, right? Even if they are data-driven.
Sorry, I see that somebody said my voice is dropping, so I'll just see. I closed the window. That helped.
Yeah, I'm getting that too, Tiff. So when Tiff and I say fuck personas, what we're talking about is personas in our experience in practice. And I think it's possible that the best personas of all time that are data driven and they're based on real insights, they do exist. Uh, and they do help build empathy, which is kind of the point. Thanks, Anka. But in our practice, they're too often these one-page PDFs with these cutesy names, right? So insert adjective and first name Harry, you've got techie Tommy and anxious Andy and whatever it happens to be, and you chuck in a bunch of data in there and you say, hey, this is the person we're building for. And you know what? If I see one more persona that says this person is really busy, I'm not going to cry. I just don't want to see it, right? No one wants to see that. Everyone is busy, so we don't need that anymore. And Tiff, yeah, all right.
Sorry, I'm getting all flushed. The voice not being clear. Can everybody hear us okay now? I've been closing windows, but it might help if you go off camera too. I'm not sure if there's a bunch of people on camera. But I'll keep going. So our story is how an exec saw that we didn't have personas and promptly asked to create some. Having just been part of that amazing implementation project that included personas at my company, I was pumped. So that I called Greg and got him pumped about it too. We got to work on a project plan that included an international segmentation for our distinct user groups, of which the last would be personas. Upon presenting this to the team and other stakeholders, we got shot down and asked to just throw together some personas based on the research we already had at the company. Exactly the more common way people perceive personas. Take it up with what we have. That's good enough. So with that direction, we decided to see what we could together with the research that already existed. Turns out, Benevity had a lot of pre-existing research across multiple brands and product lines. So we needed to get a party together to find it all and see how it all fit together.
So like Tiff said, I was a contractor at Benevity and I didn't know a lot about the organization. And anytime someone chucked existing user research at me, Tiff or someone from the product team, I would chuck it into an online whiteboard. And I just wanted to organize it all and figure out what all was going on. And so they would throw things at me, I'd throw them in the board and just stare at them for a while until something made sense. And because this was our persona project, the idea was we should try to organize everything in a traditional persona. And so we mocked up. You missed like 3 fucks, and that's about it. So we decided to do the traditional persona thing and created the Keanu persona because, of course, everyone loves Keanu. And so we were pretty jazzed up about this. We thought we had a cool little concept and we could put all this organization of information into a traditional persona. And so we met with the design leader to show them our first version of an early concept.
It's important to note that this leader who we presented Keanu to was not the one who asked for the personas. And despite loving Keanu, immediately challenged us to get rid of the fluff. They didn't want a photo, a cheesy name and backstory, or any dynamics. But we were asked to do personas. Are you sure? Wouldn't it remove the parts we'll usually use to build empathy? Should we check and see how the exec stakeholder would feel about that? You know what? Fuck it. Let's ditch the typical persona and do something we know will help product managers, designers make better decisions.
I was really sad to lose Keanu. I thought we had a win there. So yeah, after that first iteration, we started thinking about how can we make it really easy for our product teams and product managers and designers to use it, to use all this information that we're compiling basically in an online whiteboard. And one thing led to another, and we ended up creating what we're calling the User Insights Hub. And the first part of that was building a relational database to organize all this information. And that was kind of the foundation of the user role. So what is a user role? We're calling it here, it's an aggregation of user data organized around a segment of common product or service interactions. And so when we were looking at all this data, we said, hey, we have market research and some usability tests and interviews and web analytics and customer feedback and different product interactions. And at Benevity, we had an admin role, and it's a B2C company. And so we thought we can build this all around our enterprise users, the admins, the employees, and everything else. And so we chucked that admin role right in the middle of this and started organizing the data we had around this role. Now, in terms of roles, when we talk about common product or service interactions, this we found was really useful to the product team. This is how they were thinking about the product. And when we were organizing that information, it was a way that would work for them. And it wasn't arbitrary. It wasn't some fictitious representation of a person. It was like, no, all your admins are going to be accessing these product interactions. And when we have data about those interactions, it's directly related to functionality they're accessing or experiences they have as a user of the product. And so it just, everything kind of clicked and said, this is how we should organize it. If it's not B2C, and or sorry, if it's not B2B and it's B2C, you might have different roles. But the idea is you're really thinking about how do we group information around the people that are actually using their product, and how do we aggregate it around these meaningful segments. So why user role? So the research benefit from our point of view is when we aggregate all this data, it becomes really easy to scale. When you do new research, you figure out how it fits into the existing research. If you're planning a new project, you can see if you've actually already done it before. And so from a research perspective, from a research ops perspective, this is a really cool way to organize everything. So at the very least, you've kind of got a better content management system for research. From the product perspective, by organizing around these common interactions with the product, it's roles defined in a way that's still user-centric, but relevant across the organization. So anyone that understands the product and is building the product, again, whether it's a service, whether it's a product, this is a common language that everyone can get on board with to say, hey, this isn't some fictitious person. This is X user that is this relationship with our product or service. So that's kind of why I thought it made sense. So the question comes up is, well, did we just replace fictitious people with the user role? And this is a question we've gotten a couple times, like, you just recreated personas, but you put a little spin on it. And maybe we did, but we think it's structured to be different, right? So I mentioned the first part of this when we were organizing that information was putting it all in this relational database. And we'll get into the weeds on that in a little bit. But when you do that, it actually structures the personas to be different. And if you wanted to have any fluff or any fiction in there, you would have to really deliberately create it. And when you try to tie that back to research, you'd say, where is this coming from, right? It just doesn't make sense. So structurally, you have to justify everything that's in there because it's linked directly to information data that you've gotten from your users. And we actually had, when we were doing this project, one of the leaders said, hey, like, are we going to lose out on empathy if this is just data? We said, well, no, like, we can create a data attribute that is feedback from the customer, and we can bring your quotes in there. But what's really cool about doing that is when you start bringing those quotes into the user role database, you tie them, right? You tie them to the enterprise organization they're coming from. You tie them to the user roles. You tie them to, you can quantify them. You can say this quote is coming from one person, but it's attached to this pain point, and that pain point's experienced by 100 people. And so you can still have empathy in there, but it's really deliberate. I'm going to steal Tiff's, probably the best thing Tiff has ever taught me is like, what's more meaningful when you're trying to build empathy is showing a video of someone, right, during usability test. And so again, you can attach those videos to specific records in the database. So when someone goes to access it and they say, hey, this is the pain point, it's really easy for them to see a video of someone experiencing that pain point. And I totally agree with Tiff on that one. Like when you watch videos of people struggling, it's way more impactful than a persona telling you like, it's hard to interact with technology because I'm busy. I won't pick on the busy persona too much. Anyways, so they are structured to be different. So the development process in a nutshell, there's 4 steps, and it's much more, in our experience, iterative and frustrating here, but this is kind of us looking back on it in hindsight. So first, your data inventory. This is what I was talking about, where you have to figure out all the, yeah, this good point, Maria, and we will talk a little bit about that. The short answer to validating that you got it right is the iteration, which is in step 4 here. So data inventory is what I was talking about. Go across the organization. What's all the information that you currently have and you think you might have, and get all those sources of data in one place. The second step in this is organizing the data. So this is where we're trying to figure out what are the relationships between all the data. So this would be if anyone's done relational database modeling, you're basically trying to figure out like what are the attributes that we can link to different things in our database. And so we'll get into that in a little bit more detail if anyone's interested. The third piece of that is synthesis. And so you've got your data sources, you've got some organizational model to organize all that together. And then when we think about data synthesis, this is actually like when you start putting it into the database, how are you tagging it, right? How are you creating those meaningful relationships if you want to link records across each other? And how are you adding additional content, right? If you need descriptions for things like themes or why these records are important. And then the fourth piece is iterating and refining. And so Tiff and I did a lot of work as we are doing this, getting feedback from the design team. And we were saying one of the things that you really want to do when you're building out your database is thinking about the workflows, how people are going to be using it. And if you understand those and you get the feedback from the team you're actually building this for, you iterate and you incorporate in there and you kind of go back and forth between step 2 and 3 to keep improving the database. So I'll go through each of those steps in a little bit more detail. And when you talk about, some examples we could do. When you talk about the data inventory and you're thinking what data is relevant, it's literally anything that pertains to the customer. So this isn't an exhaustive list, right? But you might have quantitative data like web analytics. You might have qualitative data like customer feedback, whether that's coming from your client success managers, whether that's coming from online reviews. You could have your user interviews and your usability tests. We did a little bit of work, even trying to just incorporate heuristics into that. If we were having teams doing like investigational testing, accessibility heuristics, market research. So Tiff mentioned this. This is a great way to segment users to say, hey, maybe our product experience is different in North America than it is in Southeast Asia. Competitive research. So literally, if you're doing a data inventory and someone says, well, what's relevant? It's like, what data do you actually have about the user? We don't necessarily want your opinion. We're not going to call that data at this point unless you formalize it some way. But anything that you know about the user, we want to put into that data inventory. And this is actually one thing I'll say that's really cool about the data inventory. When you start doing this, a lot of organizations have done one piece of user research and they've created 10 reports for it, right? And so when you do a data inventory, you start figuring out like, oh, what is everything we have? And it all traces back to a research project that was 10 years ago. And it's just been like kind of tweaked a couple different times and presented to different stakeholder groups. It's really easy for a small amount of data to proliferate in a way across an organization where it looks like it's, oh, we've been talking about this problem for 10 years. And so a good thing to do in your data inventory is start thinking about like, how far back do we want to go? And how do you identify derivatives that are all from the same work? And so that's another useful thing you can do in the data inventory. And at the end of this step, if this is all you've done, you've kind of got a content management system and you fact check the data that your teams are currently building with. Okay, so yeah, totally, you can do that too. So when you think about organizing the data, again, I was doing this in an online whiteboard, right? And so we were just saying like, hey, when we talk about our user roles, we have a lot of data on pain points, right? Okay, we should create a data attribute that's pain points. And we have a lot of data on product interactions, and we have some data that's related to the tasks people are performing when we do usability tests. And so what we're trying to do is just identify these common elements across all our data sources and organize around those elements. And again, when you picture that little diagram, the wheelie thing we had at the start, that's what we talk about. You're organizing all of that data around the user role, and it can rotate like that if we had animations. And so that's your data organization, and it's really similar to database modeling. And so if you wanted to get into the weeds on it, you can just go like, oh, database modeling, how do you do it? But for us, it was a little bit more higgledy-piggledy. Okay, so data synthesis, what am I talking about here? What's the best approach to make the data available to all the different teams and purposes? So you're going to translate all that data that you've organized into the database. How do you do that, right? And we'll give an example of this in a little bit, but essentially what you're trying to do is you're going to take a usability test, take all the data out of it and chuck it into the database and start tagging it and linking it to other data. And so when I say that we have a pain point, maybe that pain point, we tag it, we link it to product functionality. This pain point only relates to this functionality. You might have to do some thematic analysis, right? So you might get a usability test that was summarized in a short report, but there's a lot of gold in there. So you might do real analysis of existing data to get more data out of it or more insights out of existing research. So there's a lot you can do there, but essentially what you're doing is you're just creating those meta tags for all the data points or all the data sources you have in your user roles database and trying to figure out what linkages do we want to make so that this is accessible as possible. So if someone goes in there and they say, I'm building a mobile experience, you're probably, and that's really important to the product team going forward, separating mobile from desktop platforms. You might go into your database, and when we talk about synthesis, anything that pertains to mobile experiences, that gets a tag, right? And then iteration and refinement. So what does your team think? We did this kind of back and forth. So it wasn't like we did 1, 2, 3, 4. We kind of did like 1 and then 4 and then 2 and then 4 and then 3 and then 4. And it was a lot of back and forth. But essentially what we're trying to figure out is how are people going to access the database? What additional analyses do we want to do? So that mobile example is a good one. We actually did that in this project where someone said, hey, I'm working on mobile. And we said, crap, I got to go back in and tag everything that's mobile. And then we'll talk about this in a little bit, but additional outputs. And so to my surprise, not everyone likes navigating a database to find information they want about the user. So just before I hand it back to Tiff here, I'll say this is just a little screenshot, and we actually have a demo of like a demo user roles database we could share at the end of this presentation so you can see what it looks like and play around with it. But when we talk about the database, the way we structured an Airtable, and not advocating for this platform, this is just one of many. I actually tried to use Microsoft Access as the starting point, and the product came that it basically made me look like I was 70 years old. So we're not going to use Access, but you could. So you've got your tables or the groups of related user data. So we had a table that was for jobs to be done in tasks, for pain points. We had a table that was for research artifacts. The records are the individual listings. So in our research repository, when we chuck it all into the Airtable, each row, right, is a source of research. And then we have our different fields. And so this is what I talk about when we start creating new tags and relationships. You just create a new field. And so this was what we were really building. That was the back end of the user role. This is everything that comes next is what the user role is built off of. I'll hand it to Steph. Yeah.
So you're probably all thinking the same as me. What the heck did Greg just explain? So basically, we started with building this relational database, and when I say we, I mean Greg, with the existing research and with the feedback from our product team and our designers, we found ways to iterate and make it more user friendly. So now let's take a look at how that went. When we initially built this database, we were all excited about it and how it connected those dots between the user roles and all that information that Greg described, all the tagging. When we started sharing it, we had this issue where not all people wanted to use a database to find info. So the first thing you do when somebody tells you what you built is confusing is you go look for somebody else to give you a different opinion. But we heard the same thing from multiple people in our team. So as we learned more about how product managers and designers would use the information in the database, we knew we needed a way for them to explore the data from different perspectives. In Airtable at the time, they had a beta feature called interfaces that you could use to build a different view of data in your database. We realized that by using this, we could create an interactive dashboard to learn about each user role. Based on this information, product teams would know where they still had gaps in information that they still needed to fill and plan research around it. For example, if they were looking for how a user who reviews grant applications decides to fund the grant or not, they might see some client feedback about what would make that easier, but there isn't much there about how they make their granting decisions today. So they would need to do some discovery interviews with some usability testing to establish a baseline experience measurement, and hopefully also plan to do some journey mapping, because we all know that that's pretty useful. So with this interactive dashboard, we finally made a few people happy. And you don't take our word for it, because Elena, one of our designers, literally said this to us the first time that they used, which was pretty nice. We finally got some validation that we were in the right direction. Even though we had made some people happy, there were still lots of people that refused to be impressed by what we had done because it was still a lot of data to go through on your own. You really still had to do a lot of synthesis, which a lot of our PMs and our designers aren't used to nor have the time for. So think of an exec who has 10 minutes to review something quickly, or someone new to the company who wants to learn about the people who use our product. It would be very daunting for them to use this interactive dashboard and try to find what they need or learn about our users. So we started thinking about how we could present this information easier. The typical persona card kept flashing into our minds, so we revisited our original card concept and tried to think of how we could make it better. So we looked at Keanu again and thought, okay, well, how do we make this better? We also wanted to use the database to populate the card so that it would never become outdated, because that was one of the biggest pain points about personas that we wanted to address. Our second iteration, which you can see here on the left, organized the data in a way that seemed to head in the right direction. But as we added more data to the database, that card quickly became a huge mess with the same problem of having to navigate through all the information. And as you can see in this third iteration, it would require a lot of synthesizing by the people looking at it. This is when we came to our critical moment. We have to synthesize the information even further, more useful for our team. So we did this and created a description of what the user role was. So that's what is up here in the top corner. Which area of the product they may interact with, some quotes to get their perspectives and build that empathy like Greg was mentioning, a section about what the user role is, and then a journey map based on their job done. After bringing in one of our designers to help make it look better, we landed on these cards that show the synthesized version of all the data in a way that feels familiar, in categories that help readers understand what they're looking at, but not so dumbed down that it feels gimmicky. The data in the card still comes directly from the database, but it's digestible and more accessible to a broader audience because it could be used also from any team at Benevity, not just our product team. Two of the most used is the what this user role wants over here on the right, and the jobs to be me. This actually has kicked off a new project this fiscal with our team. Now that we have more robust user behavior data and product analytics, we'll be building out full journey maps for each of our user groups, incorporating data and the behavioral and analytic data. And finally, everyone was happy. We recently referred to these cards in our regular design review meeting just a couple weeks. We went through the cards for 2 different user roles to validate that the outcomes the designer was trying to with their solution would meet the needs of those user roles. It's indicated that this should be higher in the priority on the roadmap since they address multiple things the user will want and aligns to multiple jobs to be done on their journey. The downside to the cards is that they don't automatically update as data in the database refreshes. Unless we start using AI to do synthesis, which I see there's a bit of AI chat going on, so we never thought about that until now. So they still require some effort to maintain. We had a plan for our design and research ops person quarterly, but when we lost that role, we had to change the process. Now it's a shared effort across the entire product team, not the responsibility of one person. This still requires process and reminders that we are still working on to help make that easier. Once we had the user role card, we had to figure out how to share this with the whole company. We decided to build a user insights hub in make people aware of it, and show them how to do it. This is our user insight. It's where Benevityites, yep, that's really ourselves, Benevityites, can come to learn about who use our product. If they click on each group, we'll see the user role cards for that group, see all the user roles that we have under each group, as well as general information that would apply to all the roles in that user group, as links to other resources or other sources of data that they can use if they're building, putting together discovery and looking for all the sources of information that we already have. They can also launch their user role dashboard from here if they want to explore this in more detail. We even had a fun video of Greg going to use the dashboard for a while when it was first in beta, rather than reading the synthesized cards. Contrary to our past persona work, the role cards have actually become the artifact that is most used by the product team. It helps kick off the it helps them stay focused in ideation, validates the direction they take with the solution. It helps them figure out who to research with to test the design. So it helps them figure out who participants should be when they're planning their research. And it's amazing when we can remove an item off the what our role wants list because we've delivered it. But don't take it from us. Here are some quotes for our team. So Patrick, one of our design managers, when I started at Benevity 4 years ago, I was desperate for this type of information. It took me years of interviewing to figure out who I was truly designing for. I'm excited that this work will accelerate every single person building our products. Thank you. Our design manager said, Shane, it's long and I already had a victory using the User Insights Hub. I was in a meeting with the PM talking about community investment, and I was able to easily pull it up and grab super detailed info about a specific goal and task. It gave us a bunch of time and work. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Hard work is really paying off and is greatly appreciated. So, what did we learn through this entire process? Greg?
So I think one of the things that we kind of learned really early on based on our experience is where personas often fall short. So there's limitations of personas, and these are the ones where we think they're often created with good intentions, right? You want to build empathy, but poor execution because they're often not data-driven. And they can mislead people into thinking they know more about the users than they actually do, or kind of down this garden path of saying, hey, if I'm designing for this fictitious person, I must be doing the right thing. And without validating that with actual data, you really don't know that. And so they can cause people to have this kind of narrow focus on solving a specific problem that might not be representative of the larger group. And like Tiff mentioned when we started this presentation, in my experience, they're not used for strategic decision making. They're ultimately an empathy building tool, and there's something that you can refer to maybe when you're doing story mapping. But ultimately, I've never had a product manager that says to me, hey, I've never been able to have the conversation with a product manager where you can quantify the pain points that you're talking about in the persona. And I think a cool example of the user role is that you can, right? If someone asks you about what they're seeing in the user role, you can go back to the database and say, here's where that's coming from. And you can have a really meaningful conversation about how much do we trust that data, right? What's our confidence that that data is something that we want to make this decision around? And it's totally fine. The user role doesn't give you the confidence in the data from the perspective of making it more important. It just makes it really transparent. So those decisions aren't these awkward conversations where you're like, well, yeah, but we did a user test and someone told us this. It's in the context of all the data you have about the user. And you can say, well, yeah, this might only be 3 people, but that's more than anything else you have. So the decision right now is, do we want to go do more user testing? Do you want to base it on 3 people, or do you want to go with your gut? And that's a much easier conversation to have from my perspective as a researcher.
Absolutely. So even if you don't use user roles, because you can see there's a ton of work that goes, here are some things that would be better than personas. First of all, actually learning about your target and what their tasks and goals are when they use your product. Or so doing some of that segmentation work, understand who you're building for, and figuring out those things, even if you don't put them in a database. Recruitment, making sure you're recruiting people using screener questions that help you target diverse users. We actually, with the help of Scott Heron, who I know is a huge advocate of accessibility in Calgary and who many of us have actually worked with, I've been able to work with him on 2 different companies, create the types of questions we would ask, identify if somebody has a differing ability and what kind of accommodations they use in their daily life. That is part of our recruitment form when people sign up for our research participant list now, so that we can make sure we're testing with those diverse users. You're always looking for people who you haven't spoken to or with yet, because oftentimes I notice that our product teams go back to that same group of people because they always say yes to the interview, easy to contact. Again, accessibility and inclusivity, building awareness and discovery, and planning to do better when you're designing the solution and intentionally for all humans. We actually have some processes within our product development lifecycle where we ask in the Asana tasks to make sure they're reviewing those things and prove that they've been thinking about incorporating it into the design and solution. Reduce cognitive load. Greg's already said this a couple times. It's busy, like that's a given. We should always be doing that. Don't need a persona to be like, oh, I'm a really busy person who's juggling different priorities. And make sure you think of use cases and scenarios that help you gain a different perspective. You've been looking at the happy path the whole time. Maybe it's switch that and bring in some of those other use cases. Somebody who isn't a professional at doing the job, or who is using something for the very first time, different things like that. So you can kind of paint that picture and go through their journey and identify where they might get hiccups. Still be a couple ways to use personas. Lack research processes and your team really strong compassion for somebody else, it might be useful to create a and help them start seeing it from another person's point of view. Although, like Greg also mentioned as well, using clips from actual research, even just having a handful of research where you did reach out to somebody who has a disability, or you did reach out to the type of user that you've spoken to before, videos from those kind of sessions will be so much more impactful in building empathy and compassion than a card with a character and some fake background and life story. If you focused on some edge cases or unique scenarios, so such as anti-personas, if you're to create the scenario of somebody hacking your product or system, or somebody who, like at the bank, is coming up the bank, those are anti-personas where there's a very specific use case for them, which really puts you to a very negative view or very perception that you probably have not explored before. So in that sort of sense, that's where persona could be really useful. You could use a template to create an interview snapshot. One of the teams we work with, who we acquired a company from Europe called, and that team did a great job of using sort of the persona card layout to create these interview snapshots after doing some interviews, so they could describe who they spoke to, what company they were from, and kind of their thoughts there. So as a way to help them the data, synthesize the data, and share it with their team. And finally, if you recognize their limitations, prevent them from being used inappropriately. So if you're going to kind of be somebody who will say, hey, we shouldn't be making this decision because we don't have enough information, like Greg has said a few times, highlighting that, okay, interesting thought, but how do we know that? Where is that information from? Do we actually have data that supports this? able to kind of be that gatekeeper of using them properly.
So a couple of things that we've asked ourselves across the way, or that people have asked us, does the tech matter? Because we haven't tried anything else, but there is lots of other stuff out there. So we don't think it matters. I think the structure is really important. The concept of building data relationships is a really useful way to start thinking about your data, whether you have a lot or a little, right? It's just a really good way to start a research operations practice. We've also wondered, are we just being semantic? So a lot of people are just like, you're just using different words for the same thing. And so are we just adding a database to personas? And I think, no, I think this is a new approach. And you can disagree with me and you can disagree with Tiff, but it's our presentation. So we're going to say no. We think user roles represent a more integrated and holistic approach to this. And I would just say, like, the reception that we've had at Benevity with them and kind of my experience with them since has been, yeah, we think they're fundamentally different in the way that we structure the data and the way that we use them and create all these different artifacts. Will it scale? So this is one of the questions that we have. You know, if you're a startup, if you're a multinational enterprise organization, how will it work out as the organization evolves? And like Tiff mentioned, you know, if you lose research operations resources, it can be a lot harder to scale it. It can be harder to add new information. And so the answer to that one is maybe. It kind of depends on how your UXR team or your product team manages this. I know Tiff has done a lot of work in kind of the research operations space, and so she can speak to this one a little bit better than I. But you do need a process around this, like you need a process around anything. I would just say if you start building a process around this, it'll be kind of bulletproof to anything else you want to do.
Yeah, I would say that we're still kind of working on that. It's really hard when you have, you know, research has become a really big thing. I'm a researcher of one over at Benevity, and the PMs and designers are expected to do some of that research work. But it's hard when you haven't experienced, when you haven't had that training. It's really hard to just process and do it. And I still find have an embedded research resource to come product team. There's always better results because they can take off how to use it. It removes that blocker hesitation of not being familiar with it or not having the experience and the comfort level. That really helps accelerate research to actually get done. So I still find it's really valuable, but I've been tweaking my processes over and over and over again every year as we continue to change even the tools we use and the makeup of and all that kind of stuff too. But so there is continuous improvement processes, but it still has been an uphill battle, I would.
So this is an obvious question now, hopefully. I mean, everyone should know the answer to this. And if you don't know, you should at least know my opinion on it. Do you need a database? And the answer is yes, you do, because that's essentially where everything lives. That's the foundation of all the research artifacts Tiff was talking about that live in the user insights hub. So the database is essentially your starting point. And it's when we talk about the user role, you can create a lot of different artifacts that embody the user role, but essentially that database is where the user role lives. And then the last question we had, these are the only things we've ever thought about. Does it always work? And, you know, I think there are probably cases where products or services or teams might ask themselves, like, does this make sense for us? And so this is one of those questions where so far we've had a lot of success with it across different organizations and trying this, but nothing's perfect. And so, you know, I think this is what we've done so far has been our experience on it. And one of the reasons that we enjoy sharing it is because people are always, you know, the concept of applying AI to the user role, does that improve it or does that diminish it? How do you staff this for a really small organization versus a large organization? These are the conversations that I think make it work better in the future or identify the limits of the approach, right? And kind of give us an indicator of like, hey, this really doesn't work in my use case. And then that's a great learning for the community, right?
Mm-hmm. So I think the last thing I'd like to leave us on is probably just it's important to keep maturing in your research practice and in your product practice. That's something that has been my biggest learning at Benevity is start where people are today. Things like, hey, let's do the NPS question. Even if you're like, we could mature past that pretty quickly. So start where you are, work with people, work getting that familiarity and comfort and experience, and then mature from there. And so as long as you continue to mature, maybe you say, okay, well, we're using personas today, but how could we be making decisions here, and where could we maybe take this and go away using personas or create something that would be better at making the right product decision product teams. So that maturity that's been a big learning for me in my years at Benevity. And that also we're completely open to have any and all questions or any thoughts on your opinion on what you saw.
I have a question, maybe a couple, if that's okay. Yeah, so I find this very interesting. Thank you for the presentation. So one question I have is, given the components that you described that were used to, I guess, segregate the data somehow, and then when you presented the snapshot of that one card, one pager of each user, I think a big component of it is jobs to be done. So with this, I guess I'd like to understand, how is this user that you are identifying different from a job performer, or is it the same?
Do you want to? I'm happy to start with this one, Tiff, and jump in. So, Alex, yeah, I think that if you were to call a job performer, and I'm not exactly sure what that means if it has like a really specific thing, but if you're thinking about the person who has all those jobs to be done across their product or experience lifecycle, I would say it's the same, right? It's their interactions, and those interactions are being embodied through the jobs to be done. And I would just say, like, if you use that as your starting point and you're doing that modeling piece, if you can build everything else around that, that makes a really good kind of central attribute. So you could call it, instead of a user role, a job performer, and you would just say, hey, like, is that the top level? Is there anything above a job performer? And that it's like multiple roles they fit into multiple job performers. And so when I say that, I'm thinking like, how many product capabilities solve those jobs, right? Okay, we can tie that data attribute in. And when those job performers are accomplishing those jobs, is that where we want to tie in our pain points? And when we do user research, is that how we build our usability tests around the tasks that are comprising those jobs? And if all that feels true, and as you're building it out, that ends up being a really good central attribute to aggregate your data around, that's what your organization should do. And that just ties into that comment I made earlier on, is like user roles made a lot of sense when we were building this out at Benevity and the way we define them. But when we came to that definition, it was with feedback from the product team and it was with feedback from UX research. And so we landed there based on thinking about how people thought about product experiences and how they were designing them.
I would also add that I feel like the jobs to be done is one data attribute that's part of the user role. And for me, the user role it's somebody who has a specific role when they come into our platform, but there's so many different jobs to perform, and those jobs could also change over time and change with different features and functionality that you introduce into the platform. So I feel like for me, calling it a job performer and focusing it just around those jobs to be done feels a bit narrow, because there's all the actions they took before they came into your platform and all the actions that they take after they've been in your platform too. If you make that into a journey map, those are like innovation moments. Figure out, okay, what are the different things that they're doing and supplementing outside of our platform. Um, and this is just semantics, but for me, when I hear job performer, I feel like that keeps us too long into the actual platform and doesn't take into consideration every part of the journey. But that's just my thoughts on the semantic use of that term versus user roles.
Thank you. And did you base this research or this particular, I guess, project out of one particular approach to jobs to be done? Because I mean, there's others that say the job is timeless, it's never going to change. And you just mentioned that they change. So I'm curious if you base it based on one particular author of this.
No, we didn't base it on one particular author, but we based it on the types of jobs, like how we define jobs to be done at Benevity. So we try to focus on, there's two levels. There's high level jobs to be done, which is like a higher level where you're running, for example, your charitable program as somebody who runs an nonprofit. Then there's task level job to be done underneath that. So your high level job to be done may be more timeless, but the task level jobs to be done could change more over time. So we did have sort of a two hierarchy of jobs to be done, if that makes sense, that we kind of look at that high level goal and the tasks that are related to achieving that goal.
Yeah, no, that makes 100%. That's exactly how I understand it, because it's at the value proposition level of a company versus when you do your user research and look at, yeah, what they're trying to accomplish. So thank you.
I think, Marissa, do you want to let us know? You've probably been watching all the questions and stuff in the chat. So if you want to let us know what questions have come up.
Yeah, for sure. First up is Mary. Mary, I don't know if you want to unmute and ask your few questions.
Yes, I maybe asked too many, but hi. Yeah, I just yeah, I guess one of my starting ones there was to, like, we have all these other attributes like you've defined in each one of those. And for me, it's like, hey, you could look at those other dimensions too, like the jobs to be done, it's other pieces. I'm just wondering about, yeah, as you see all those other elements come to place, you could also cross-cut across those other aspects. And I'm just wondering how you avoid the spaghettification of all that information and say, oh, now I don't know what I'm looking at anymore, even though I've clicked all this stuff. So yeah, how have you gone down that way, or perhaps learned the hard lessons of going down that way?
Greg, I feel like that's a you question.
Yeah, Murray, when you said spaghettification, I was like, I've been spaghettified with this project. Like we had Tiff, I haven't looked at it. I can't remember how many records we had in here and how many permutations of these linkages we could have. It was wild. And so in terms of deciding like when you wouldn't do it, I think as a researcher, sometimes you go down a rabbit hole because you're like, this is super interesting. And sometimes it pays off because one other person thinks it's interesting too. But from a team perspective, I think the scope that we put around this is really like, how are we going to use this? And one of the ways it felt really helpful for me to conceptualize like what rabbit hole should I go down is like, whose work am I supporting by doing this? So if I create these linkages and if I cross-cut it in this way, what is someone doing that when they look at the data that way, they're better at whatever work they have. And so that's kind of a qualitative approach to it. But I think we had lots of chats with Tiff and the product team as we were doing this version of it. And we were kind of like, yeah, like I don't need to go down to those rabbit holes until someone asks at the very basic level. But we had a team that really cared about the jobs to be done when they're doing product planning. And we had teams that had really well-defined product capabilities. And we had a lot of pain point data that it was relevant across every team. And so that was kind of our starting point. And as we were tagging things, it was a process of like, oh, like these tags are really apparent in the data. They've already been analyzed by previous researchers. So we're going to incorporate them. There's very little synthesis. I'm literally just transcribing versus someone asks a new question or says it would be really valuable to do this. And then it's that effortful piece of like, now I'm starting to tag it. One thing I'll say that was really useful about the database model is when we update a record of one place, it updates everywhere, right? And so that made it easier from my perspective to just say, you know what, we have a thing where we track the pain points, right? And you can assign them to product teams. If something gets solved, I just go to the pain points table and say, yeah, this is solved, this is in progress. And then it just updates everywhere. And then when we go to create those role cards, you can deprioritize that, right? It's no longer in the top of the pile because it's been solved, like Tiff mentioned, like they're using update. So that's a long answer to your question. And I don't know if it's even an answer, but the term spaghettification is something that resonates.
And one thing we did, Marie, is that we actually hosted workshops with each of the product teams and the different product portfolios. And we asked them, can you tell us the types of questions that you would have when you come in here? Because we did a demo of the database. And I think at that point, Greg, we had the interface, the first version of the dashboard. So we did a bit of a demo, showed them all the data that was in there already. We said, what questions would you have when you come to the database? So that we could kind of create almost little use cases for each product team and make sure, and that was another way that we could prioritize, okay, this data is going to be really, really important more than this other data that we also have found. We're going to prioritize what to put in the database first. Because we also only had Greg for a short time, so we had to kind of prioritize how much work to give him and what to prioritize in the database before he was let go. So, yeah.
So sorry if I could follow up on that, but so how are you maintaining these? Like you said, the team is taking care of them, but do you think you're going to have like a user role owner or something like that?
So we did have an amazing design and research ops person. Her name's Kimberly Dean. I love her so much. She was doing amazing work. And we did lose that role. So it is slowed down significantly. So there is research that's getting done that we have not added to the database yet. So that is one hiccup. There's also, just like literally last week, the hiccup of one of our product directors saying, hey, by the way, we're using AHA better now, because we kind of always been there, but there's always like, oh, we're not going to use it anymore. And then, yes, we are. No, we're not. Yes, we are. So now somebody's actually taking the initiative to say, yes, we are using it, and here's how we're going to be using it. So now, and Greg and I actually asked about how when we first started working on this, like, hey, this tool, like, what are we using it? Are we not using it? So it's going to be really interesting to see how people use that. And it might completely change what this database really is for. And then we will probably be able to maintain it to be more like a research repository potentially, rather than necessarily helping prioritize a roadmap and things like that. Or we might be able to incorporate them somehow and have them leverage each other. So we're actually working on figuring that out right now. And we did get another resource to help with a bunch of sort of that behavior analytics stuff and all that kind of stuff. So I have a little bit more support now. But you're right, that's a risk. And again, when you put a process, yes, we've put a process in Asana. Yes, they're supposed to check off the task that says I've incorporated my data in the database and I've done these specific tasks to do that, or steps. And yeah, it very, very rarely gets done. So it's still an issue that we're trying to figure out.
So do you think you're going to be done some point so I can learn all the lessons you'll learn before I try to go down that path?
Listen, we're all part of product teams, Murray. We know that iterations never stop, right? There's always improvements to be made. So I don't know if this will ever be done.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, next up, sorry if I mispronounce your name, Sitare. She was just here on camera. Yeah.
Yes. Hello. Hi. Okay. My question is that, okay, we always need to maintain the personas, but it changes over time. So how can we make sure that it's the right time to iterate personas and gather information for updating personas? And this is the first question. And the second question is that, okay, it takes a lot of time. So what should we do now? Is it the right time or it's not? And it's a bit, it's a tough question for me. So yeah, here we go.
I can give you an answer from my previous work at ATB, because we had created segmentations a couple times. We had created personas a couple times. We even created a persona website, very similar to the User Insights Hub, only very focused on the personas. And we showcased the personas first before you even got to see the segments, which is one thing that we realized was a mistake. So for us back then, I feel like once we realized that people were not talking about the actual users enough anymore, we kind of went, okay, maybe this has gotten stale. When we started seeing people not referencing that material anymore, we're thinking, okay, we need to add something. We need to bring in some new information. We need to maybe approach this from a different direction. So it was more an exercise of how the data is being used and watching for things being referenced. And if that's not happening, there might need to be a refresh. There also could be a big change staff. So if you've had a lot of turnover, a lot of change in who's leading, especially if you have like directors that have changed over and things like that, then it's really important to bring their attention to it. So either reminding them that the current ones are there, or again, refreshing it to make it more relevant, because they're obviously coming from a lot of different companies and perspectives. And so they might bring some ideas around how we can make it more relevant for them to use that information. It could be also, so for some of the work that we did, we actually a layer. So in our segmentation and persona work, we did the cluster analysis and got segments out of our that we did with Insights West. And they created those 6 segments. When we were looking at those segments and how they naturally fell into this sort of timeline, we went, hang on here, there's a level that we're not talking about, which is life stages. That's where we actually pulled out the life stages, and that became the most relevant level for any strategic making. And so even just looking at the data after we had already created the segments and personas again, thinking and just trying to look for some sort of trends in that data, it helped us realize that there's a third level here that can really help us. And if you think about it, if you create banking around life stages, that changed the game. And so that's sort of the direction we started taking at that life stage level instead of the segments and personas. So those segments and personas were very rarely referenced in any of the strategic decision making, and even in a lot of the designing as well, because we were looking at those life stages, as well as another attribute, which was the relationship they wanted to have. So we had 3 different types of relationships people would want to have with their bank that could happen through any of those life stages. So those 2 pieces became the most important attributes in decision making. And I look for, does your personas, do they have those attributes that really help people make those decisions? And if they don't, that's maybe another signal that we need to refresh this and revisit it and bring some new information in. Does that help answer your question? I know there's an official recipe. Maybe there's other people that have an opinion on, but that's kind of what has happened in my work experience.
Yeah, thank you. Just one question, please. If Greg has anything to add, so I can ask. Okay, thank you. Just in the middle of Greg's lecture, actually, he said something that I just want to make sure. I think he said that okay, our personas are not for decision making, but for making empathy with users. Am I right?
Yeah, that sounds like something I
Yeah.
said. I don't know if
Okay, so
that's everything about personas, but that was part of it. Yeah.
yeah. So, okay, when you want to empathize with your users, so it's somehow actually affects the decision-making step, right? For example, you want to target a specific, I don't know, a community or group of people. So it actually affects some decision-making, right?
I think it can. So I think one of the things is if that empathy surfaces something, and Tiff has a really good articulation of that I'm going to steal. I think it depends on where you are in that maturity cycle. And if the team really needs that empathy built, I think that's one of the examples where it's useful to do that. And it might be that it's a product team that really needs that empathy. I think it's a cool kind of case that personas came out of the 90s when you had HCI folks that were building in a bubble and then weren't really thinking about the users when it gained all the momentum to say this is revolutionary. And so I think that's a good example of where personas can have value. I think the risk when I say it doesn't inform decision making is if you're deciding on a product feature and that empathy that you have is about the product feature, or I guess thinking about various levels of decision making. If it's, is this important and should I allocate product resources to solve this problem or build this experience, that empathy likely isn't enough for the team to care a lot about it. They're going to want more information. And I would say that's not always true. But I would say very often you have this experience to say, yeah, like we know we need to build accessible experiences. We know we need to build multi-ethnic experience. We know we need to, people know this, and the empathy helps them agree it's important, but it gets deprioritized, right? Because there's other things. There's technical bugs to fix. There's debt that needs to be resolved. There's a business model, right? There's something in there that the business requirements are driving decisions. And unless those personas are building empathy in a way that aligns with business requirements for expansion, right, into a new market, there's just so many ways that empathy is important, but it gets deprioritized relative to other requirements the organization has or the team has. That's my opinion.
Yeah, and I would just add that it helps make the decision that, oh, this is a problem worth solving because that person actually matters and their perspective matters or their experience matters. But I agree with Greg that I think when you look at the overall decision making and strategic level decision making that you need to do, it just gets deprioritized. I agree with Greg in that. So, and like I said, that's where videos come in, because if you have somebody with a disability actually trying to use your system and struggle, that's going to be way more impactful against, very high up the ladder to actually put some resources towards fixing something versus a persona card, which will say, okay, now we see why it matters, but I might still not put the resources fixing this.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right, Alan, did you have a point to add to that, or can I continue?
New question.
I might get back to you on that one and just continue along my list. All right, next up is Elazar. Again, sorry for the pronunciation. If you're still here, feel free to unmute.
Yeah, thank you. You got the name properly. A great presentation. Thank you so much. I'm just kind of I'm looking at this. Greg dropped a demo of the user roles, and it's pretty amazing. The question I want to know is, so when people look at research, often depending on why they're looking at the research, they might interpret it differently. And I'm wondering, like, is there a way that other departments are interacting with this data, or if decisions are made that, you could look at the user row one way and, make some decisions, and then maybe, the engineering team saw it a completely different way. Is there some way to kind of rein that in, or do you kind of stay out of that and let them kind of look at the data their way?
Yeah. First off, it's nice to meet you, Alan. I know we've connected on LinkedIn a bit, so nice to finally. That's a really great question. Right now for our user roles, our development team and our design team and our product team work so closely together in their triads that they're usually looking all together. So that really helps everybody talk about it and talk through it and kind of come to a consensus, the insights that they're drawing from it and how they're going to use insights. We try to make it so that insights are there. That's where the synthesized card comes in handy, because even when you're looking at the raw data, you can refer to how we've synthesized it. You can continue to draw your own conclusions. The teams in our company tend to use it more as I'm going to go learn about how to use our product. So they're more reading it for they're new to and they're learning about it. But that's a really good point. And that's where I think I'll go back to saying, like, I think it's still important to have research resources embedded in teams, because they can help make sure that insights are being used in alignment across all product teams, that nobody's misinterpreting things. You're flagging that maybe we don't know enough about that. What I've been really coaching our team about is, when you see something, do you understand why it's actually happening? Understand the context behind that pain point, or why it's happening, or what is causing it. That might not include everything that's within our platform. So those kind of questions, where I encourage people to then get that context. We'll have some interviews to talk about that pain kind of thing. That's another really big piece that, like in a tool like AHA, there'll be an idea there. You might not have all the information, just pick it up and go build it. You still do the research around that idea before you go do stuff. So I don't think there's ever a way to completely prevent that different interpretation happening from some of this data, but hopefully there's being collaboratively enough that at least as a team, we're agreeing on how that data is being used and the decision on it. Greg, maybe you have some thoughts.
Yeah, and I think when we were doing this really selfishly, Tiff wanted to create this self-serve repository of information so people would stop bugging her. And so part of it was like, hey, let's build a dashboard and people will stop asking me questions. They'll just log on and do their own work. And Elzar, to your point, like, man, I never thought about like, what does self-serve access to data mean when you still have that subjectivity of like you type in a query, right? And you say like, I'm interested in mobile experiences, and you read one research resource and you're like, this is all there is to it, and you didn't realize that the experience that we designed didn't make it apparent that you looked at one of 10 resources, right? Or that there was contradictory information, or that you're looking at old information. It's like, Tiff and I kind of joked that when we were building these artifacts, it was a really user-centered design process, right? Because we're getting all this feedback, but we never validated that. Like, we never usability tested this. We never looked at all the people that were going to use it. And so, I think that's such a cool question. And I like Tiff's comment around like, how do you get the team working together? How do you orient them to the tools and the processes that are coming out of this user roles dashboard? I think one of the things that I really enjoyed doing, I think was helpful at the get-go, was was we created like onboarding videos. And so almost in parallel to this, we were creating these like educational resources that were also self-serve. So you go into the Insights Hub and you click a video, and you hear my droning voice being like, "And welcome to the user roles dashboard." And that was kind of our way to orientate people to how they could use it. We don't know if that's how they did use it, and we don't know all the other ways it could be used. And so I think your question just highlights like, yeah, that's something I'd never thought of before, but it's interesting and definitely worth something validating. So if Tiff needs another contractor, Benevity, to do that, she can call me.
All right, perfect. I know we have a couple of questions left. I just wanted to check in with you, Tiff and Greg. I know we're a bit over time. How are you doing?
We get to miss bedtime with 4 children, so we're fine. We're gonna keep drinking our wine and answering questions.
Sounds good.
Once they go to bed, I'm jumping off, so we have another 20 minutes here, I think.
Sounds good. Okay, the next question is from Alex again. Do you want to ask your second question? Your third?
Yes, thanks. So my question is, I think, a little bit related to the previous one, but I'm thinking more on the sense of, do you have any kind of control, or do you even care to prevent whether or not, for example, marketing may come up with their marketing personas for whatever purposes, advertising or GTM strategies? I love to learn a little bit more about that.
It's funny you say that, because our team does have personas, and it's the marketing team does. So we have sales personas, the type of person that you're selling to, where they have somebody, and I can't remember if you know the names, but it's somebody seasoned, so somebody who's been in that role of maintaining corporate social responsibility program for years and years. And then there's the person who just started a job and stuff. So we did have our marketing and sales team that already had these personas created. So we did take some of the data from the original research that created those personas and incorporated it into the dashboard, but we didn't recreate the persona. And so we did talk a little bit with the team to say, okay, we need to come up with the sales journey of a specific type of person, somebody who's really seasoned in the role, somebody who's brand new to the role, and this would be a much better software to bring in company. If that's relevant for that team to be able to help kind of visualize 2 different scenarios and create different sales journeys for the scenarios. We also have sales segments, so we segment our clients into different categories. So that's kind of got a very unique use case for why they have those personas and to help train the sales team on how you would talk with those different types of roles. So if that works for them on how they create the training content for their sales team to be able to say, okay, if you're talking to a very seasoned veteran, here's how you describe our product. Here's how you don't have to worry about walking them through every feature and stuff like that. But here's how you would talk to who's brand new to this area, who's just been asked, hey, can you go buy Benevity and this implemented across our company? You would be hands-on, you'd explain every feature in more detail and that kind of thing. So it helped them kind of train their staff how they would be in those different sales scenarios. So in that sense, I feel like that's a perfectly fine way to use persona. They're making decisions on how to train their staff. They're not making decisions on what they would build in the product necessarily. So I feel like that was an okay example of using personas.
Thanks.
All right, last but not least, I think it's Pi, if you want to unmute. It looks like you're unmuted. I just can't hear. Oh, there you go.
I think that's me. Sorry. I think the question, if I'm reading the question, how long did it take to develop user roles? I'm actually glad you asked that because Greg, we did that analysis right before this presentation on Monday. So why don't you go ahead and answer that?
And before I answer that, I just see I see popped up there off mute. Is that the question? Are we good there?
That was their question.
Okay. Just don't trust Tiff. Yeah, so I think lots of different ways to answer this. So the project lasted about 9 months, and it wasn't like 9 months full time, and it wasn't 9 months. This is the only thing I did while Tiff and I were working together. And we were trying to figure out like if you were to do flat out full time, how long would this take? It wouldn't be 9 months. We ballparked it was probably somewhere between like 10 and 15 weeks. And it's also tricky to call it 10 and 15 weeks because you have like the meeting time and you're kind of waiting around to meet with the different teams that have different workflows and different feedback to do your product iterations. So I would say in this case, like it was 9 months, maybe it was 10 to 15 weeks of work across those 9 months, but how long it will take is really going to depend on how we scope that data inventory. So Benevity had a bunch of data, like Tiff mentioned, she used to be with ATB and there was much more data. And so if your data inventory comes across and you've got heaps and heaps of research, it's going to take heaps and heaps of time. If you're a startup, like one of the cool things I think about this is, working with smaller companies, if you were to start building this out really early on, you wouldn't have a lot of data in there. And so maybe the value of doing it feels less, but it would be really quick to build it out and to use something like this for just like the scalability. When you do new research, you add it in there and it's really easy to identify gaps in what you've done already. So a big part of how long it's going to take is going to be dependent on when you do your data inventory, how much do you have, how are you scoping, what do you care about, right? Maybe you care more about your usability tests and your user interviews and customer feedback than you care about web analytics, right? Maybe that saves you some time. So I would say relative to personas, to do this end to end, it takes longer for sure if you have lots of data. If you have no data, it would be quicker than personas because you have nothing to create.
Perfect. That was all of our questions, I think.
Fantastic. So I have one question, and this is the most important question. Greg, Tiffany, what is the best way for reach out to you, to connect with you, to follow up on any of the thoughts that you have shared Tiffany, would you like to propose some ideas?
As I'm madly running to LinkedIn to grab my LinkedIn profile. Yeah, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I do go on there probably at least once a week to kind of check out what's going on. So let me just grab my profile link here. And then also my email is tiffany.kieboom@com. So happy to chat about this kind of stuff. It's been really interesting since the last time Greg and I presented this at UXPA. We were stuck in that room for like an hour after the presentation talking with people. We had academics that were mad at us for even suggesting to fuck user personas. And then we had other people who were like, no, we love this. This is, I want to take this and take it to my company and my boss. Tell them, see, I'm not crazy. So yeah, it's a really fun conversation that we're happy to continue to have.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tiffany.
Greg doesn't want to get
Greg?
contacted by anyone.
No.
Thanks. I see. Sandra, what are you doing? Yeah, LinkedIn is easy, and my my email address is greg.hallihan@humaninsights.ca. I think that's right. Yeah, so LinkedIn is easy peasy, or via email is also easy peasy.